As a Fallout fan from back when the isometrics were all we had, I personally already had my moment of disillusionment with the modern direction of the Fallout franchise back with Fallout 4. There were so many things I wanted that game to be, and in the end it wasn't any of them. Fallout 4 was thematically sloppy, dramatically limp, and difficult to connect with on any level beyond the mechanical. With the Far Harbor DLC, they did reverse course and made something more traditionally Fallout. Far Harbor was stronger, tighter written, and more memorable than the main game by far. Far Harbor, though, was a deviation from the new vision of what a Fallout game is supposed to be like, rather than the new norm. The last DLC for Fallout 4 was the most prophetic. Nuka World was the Fallout aesthetic boiled down to a literal theme park, where a new endgame for the main world was introduced that let you raid the settlements you'd spent so long building up, ensuring that any sense of meaning or permanence you might have held on to dissolves into a pool of caustic novelty. Fallout 4 was often beautiful, it was exciting, it was engaging in its own ways, which were principally mechanical. To enjoy Fallout 4, I had to let go of my own expectations for the game and try to figure out what the game was trying to do instead, if it wasn't living up to the Fallout in my mind's eye. Fallout 4 was such a frustrating, transformative experience that I paid almost no attention to Fallout 76 at all when it was being developed. It was centered around multiplayer, after all, not single-player. It was a reiteration of Fallout 4's crafting loop, but even fiddlier. It would have no living NPCs, no player dialogue at all. Every revelation about the game seemed almost precision-engineered to irritate me and diminish my interest. Now that it's out, it's Bethesda's worst-reviewed game in years and years, and the backlash has been massive. This puts me in a bit of an awkward position, though. I had zero expectations about this game. I thought it was going to be a miserable disaster. I was ready to hate it. But I played it for like 116 hours, went down damn near every road, found close to nearly every marked location, and I have to say I liked it a lot more than I ever did Fallout 4. Its aggressive artificiality and lack of meaningful storytelling or player choice aren't so much new directions as they are honest reckonings with something that's always been true about the Bethesda Fallouts. Believability of character and concreteness of world have never been priorities compared to visual iconography and expansive dungeoneering. Fallout 76 is, truly, the full flower of a seed that was planted back in Fallout 3 when you could choose to detonate a nuclear bomb and destroy the town of Megaton because you and some old man in a tower thought that it would be kind of fun. Fallout 76 is utterly disconnected from the original games and the approach to RPG design on display in Fallout New Vegas. This disconnection is, counterintuitively, what makes Fallout 76 more likable than Fallout 4. It's not pretending to be interested in things that the developers clearly aren't actually interested in, like dialogue, like environmental consistency or believability, like thematic depth and player choice. So instead of Fallout 4, where it tried to include those things in incomplete, unenthusiastic ways, this time it simply chucks them out the window entirely to focus on what Fallout means to Bethesda as an action-first experience and a consumer franchise. A lot of the reaction to Fallout 76 has been a kind of wounded surprise, holding up how estranged the game is from what made people fall in love with the setting and the franchise in the first place. I'm not saying those people are wrong. On the contrary, I do largely agree. But I don't agree with the surprise. Nuka World wasn't just the final DLC for Fallout 4, it was a statement of intent. It was a way of looking at Fallout that saw the wasteland as a theme park. Ride the Radon Blaster, stop for a delicious iguana on a stick, pose for a picture with a real live ghoul, visit Deathclaw Island, be sure to hit the gift shop on the way you're out. It confused the choice to set the apocalypse in a 50s retro future from its original purpose as a source of black humor and cultural critique with a genuine celebration of mid-century consumerism. Fallout 76 not only continues, but doubles down on that trend. In fact, it's a more materialistic game than even Diablo, for the most part. The large and small parts of the game's crafting loops all come back down to stuff. Always needing more stuff. Always needing better stuff. Every second of play is fundamentally motivated by and oriented towards acquisition of stuff. Previous Fallouts have revolved around frontier politicking, races against the clock, fulfilling an iffy prophecy. Even Fallout 4 was, in the end, kind of about choosing a vision for humanity's future in the Commonwealth from the 4 options provided. Fallout 76 has one plot, one moral, one law. Shop till you drop, then respawn and shop again. The reason there hasn't yet been a global thermonuclear conflict is a thing called MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. It's not just that two large arsenals going off will cancel each other out, it's that enough nukes going off at once will poison the entire planet in drastic, irrevocable ways. The largest is a thing called nuclear winter. The idea is like how volcanoes can blot the skies for days and weeks, and how the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs filled the air with impenetrable smoke for months and years. A global nuclear war and its resulting firestorms will kick up so much radioactive dust and debris into the atmosphere that it will create a barrier to light that will kill forests and kill the ecosystem, and then the radioactive particles will fall all over the world as part of the literally apocalyptic weather that kind of disturbance would kick up. This could go on for years, decades even. This is why previous Fallouts, and post-nuclear media in general, has once verdant areas portrayed as desert. Once the air clears, there will be little left alive on the ground, from the tallest tree to the lowliest moss. Land laid to waste, wasteland. Fallout 76 takes place just 25 years after the bombs fell, making it, by a huge margin, the closest Fallout in time to the especially severe part of the nuclear apocalypse that the nuclear winter represents. So when I heard that was the year the game was set, I expected an extra broken, extra barren, extra cruel environment. Instead, Fallout 76 takes place in a verdant paradise where everyone is dead anyway from a pandemic of plot convenience. The idea is that the bombs didn't directly fall on West Virginia, being of limited strategic importance, and so it was spared the kind of devastation that marked the capital wasteland in the Commonwealth. Sure, there's mutations galore and the questionable inclusion of iconic enemies like super mutants and rad scorpions, but Fallout 76 tries to channel the natural, rural splendor of real-life West Virginia by ignoring the effects of nuclear winter and assuming that life will find its irradiated way just fine and dandy. When you look at the Chernobyl incident, for example, how nature made a comeback into the area and how one of the most dangerous places for humans is now one of the safest places for wolves, you can see how they might creatively arrive at the idea. But a meltdown at a power plant and a world war are two different categories of atomic disaster. 20 years after the war is close enough to the nuclear winter to show wasteland at its rawest and most devastated. Fallout 4 was set 200 years after the war, for reference, so the tentative and sickly plant life in that game did feel appropriate and sensical. There's nothing, though, to explain the eternal autumn of Fallout 76's Appalachia that makes sense, unless you stop for a moment and consider the game in context with its peers and the current cultural moment of the United States. Although it features no living humans, the game expresses the anxieties of the pop cultural zeitgeist it was created in much more than any previous entry in the series. In many ways, the question is less, how does Fallout 76 compare to previous Fallouts, and more, why does Fallout 76 compare so directly to Far Cry 5? Both games use massive open worlds to present a kind of idealized American pastoral image, to use the frivolous violence and condensed visual artistry of the video game medium to try to articulate a hopeful reaffirmation of the old tropes of rugged individualism and self-determined frontier morality. That Fallout 76 ignores a nuclear winter is kind of a big deal. It's a well-known, widely understood consequence of nuclear war. To portray that consequence, though, would be to put creative emphasis on the cycles of predatory consumption that defined pre-war American Fallout as a terminal disease, one that killed the host eventually. Instead, West Virginia is changed, but in many ways spared. This colorful backdrop allows the game to sell the old stories and Western myths at face value, where a wasteland's bitter and implacable emptiness would always work to subvert those things. Instead, players get to live out what's essentially a frontier homesteading fantasy with that pesky nuisance of existing civilizations and cultures surgically removed from the equation to give the player the blankest canvas possible. So, the vault opens, the people pour out, and the cycles of consumption and destruction begin again, free of guilt, free of memory, a world where the shelves are always full and the flowers are always blooming. You can even nuke it again yourself, and in 4 hours' time, no one will even know it happened. The system's designed to keep Fallout 4 in perpetual motion, to keep the player in an endgame hamster wheel where the game is never truly over in the traditional sense, were some of the most discouraging, frustrating features of that game. Yet, in Fallout 76, the cyclical pointlessness of clearing an area feels less arbitrarily discouraging and more compellingly necessary due to the mandatory always-on multiplayer of the game's design. Fallout 76 is neither massively multiplayer nor only small group co-op. Instead, it puts 24 people on a discrete server. If you have friends, you can join their server, and vice versa. Each server keeps track of items in its world separately, so a location you loot on one server may be fully stocked and untouched on another. Nukes fired on one server do not affect another, so if you leave one server where you've detonated a nuclear weapon, that blast zone will no longer be available to you. The map is extremely large, and generally speaking, it's unusual to come across another player. But you do more frequently find their handiwork, dead enemies and empty shelves. If a lot of players are in one region, like the low-level areas around Vault 76 on launch day, then the experience is frustratingly competitive. Fallout 76 does create individually instanced loot tables for individual players when looting containers and corpses, but items on the ground and items on shelves, usually the best items, refresh only once every so often. Enemies recycle frequently, but you can't loot enemies you haven't had a hand in killing personally. So there's a major incentive for scavenging to be done not only away from other players, but away from places that other players frequently traffic in a general sort of way. Most often, you'll find other players while doing events, repeatable side quests, which you can fast travel to on the map, even if you haven't discovered the area yet. So, even if you've been alone for a while, if you do a cool event, there's a good chance someone will drop in to share the fun. Then you'll make a friendly emote, and you'll part ways again, off to pursue your own agendas. And that's it. Fallout 76 is moderately multiplayer this way, a social space whose vast distances and demanding crafting loops discourage actually sharing the space. In Fallout 4, when I cleared a place and a day later it reset its enemies and items like I'd never been there at all, it made me feel like I'd wasted my time. Now, I'm kind of grateful for it, because if I go to a place and find it mostly barren and picked clean already, I know that if I simply come back in half an hour, I'll get the whole cornucopia of desk fans and typewriters and precious duct tape. As a multiplayer experience, there's an understood that nothing can ever truly be resolved because the conflicts have to remain available for other players to come along and be the hero for it. It takes the sting out of stuff like Preston Garvey's Infinite Quest log. There, in Fallout 4, you'd turn in a randomly generated quest and immediately receive a randomly generated quest in a one-for-one loop that can never end. A single-player role-playing game ought to allow the player to conclude what they do, to see some sort of climax to their effort. Fallout 4's constant undermining of the value of the player's actions with its perform action A at location B for reward C structure of procedurally generated hamster wheel quests diminished the sense of the player's concreteness in the world, their agency, their meaning. In Fallout 76, there is no expectation of resolution. No one goes to Disneyland, rides the Indiana Jones ride, and then says, "What's everyone waiting in line for still? We already escaped the temple." It's not a narrative, it's an amusement, even if it is, still, an officially licensed Indiana Jones adventure. You can go get a hot dog and a soda, you can come back, you can do it again. You can come back in a year, it'll still be the same, save for the stalactites of chewing gum under the seats being larger. This is why most activities in the game, by a big margin, are events and not side quests. Ride the ride, get your friends, get back in line, do it again. Fallout 76 isn't a role-playing game in any meaningful way, not any more than Grand Theft Auto Online can be, with players pretending to be cops and robbers. It's Nuka World, made manifest as its own gigantic game map. There are even at least 3 actual amusement parks in the game world, all with events that function as carnival games, like a scavenger hunt for a Jangles the Moon Monkey doll, or a time trial for putting coal in little hidden ore carts. Having adjusted my expectations for Bethesda's Fallout canon down to a half-hearted shrug with Fallout 4, I was able to ignore what I wanted the game to be and focus on the bizarre carnival that it actually is. I don't expect an amusement park to have narrative consistency as much as I expect them to have funnel cake, and Fallout 76 straddles that line between artistic experience and coin-operated frivolity more precariously than nearly any other AAA game I've played in the past few years. Fallout 76 may not be much of a Fallout game when put side by side with the originals, but if you liked the originals and can stomach the idea of essentially visiting an ultra-violent, absolutely colossal digital Chuck E. Cheese's with Fallout-themed attractions and iconography for a time, then you know what, there's a good chance you'll still enjoy the time you spend with the game. This is the guiding design principle of Fallout 76. Nothing is permanent, nothing is quite believable, but fun is king, and there are prizes galore. That's been the driving paradox of the game for me. It ought to be something I don't like, and it's certainly something I didn't want when it was described to me before release, but every time I play it, I end up having a great time. No matter how dumb it is, no matter how badly it breaks, no matter how low the frame rate dips, I just keep sitting there, playing it in a pleasant fog. Even if it's little more than an amusement park, it is genuinely amusing. Take the way most quest rewards are set up. With a few exceptions among the main quests and the more complicated side quests, you typically receive your reward immediately after completing your objective. You'll kill a giant monster or find a hidden cache, and suddenly your HUD will light up like a slot machine, and a selection of useful items, from food and drink to armor pieces, magically appear in your inventory. You can fast travel for a handful of caps from event to event, mainlining that Skinnerian reinforcement right into your eyeballs, completing maybe a half dozen events in half an hour, more if you're lucky and the map's generating a lot of activity. You'll never have to slow down by returning to a quest giver, and most quests begin with a blast of dialogue over the radio, so there's often no concrete quest giver in the first place to return to. Since the rewards often give you a handful of resources that are more geared towards simply keeping you playing than enriching your character in any serious way, no single event is likely to quench an appetite for progress in a given play session. You'll have to do quite a few to see meaningful gains, and even then, the resources you use to complete an event might far outweigh what you get as a reward, putting you at a net negative in things like ammunition and rare repair components. So, to supplement the event side-questing cycle, it's important to layer in scavenging diversions. Most locations of the hundreds marked on the map, and the hundreds more unmarked locations, don't have any kind of formal content associated with them. Many don't even have a consistent enemy type, repopulating with something new after you or some other player temporarily clear the area out. Sometimes there's a little skeleton tableau to see and notes to read. With little luck, sometimes these notes and skeletons even contribute to a broader understanding of the world and its past events. Unlike Fallout 3, and to a lesser extent Fallout 4, most locations in the game world are not separated by a loading screen. They exist in reasonable architectural proportions in full integration with the landscape surrounding them. They're dense and quick, just like the events. This makes repetition easier to bear. Even if you get sent back later on, or find yourself sweeping through on a scavenging run, or playing the area with someone who hasn't seen it before, you're never committing more than 10 minutes or so to a single task. And then the depth and density of the map means that you're never more than 2 minutes away from the next thing to do. Perhaps most critically of all, because there is minimal narrative motivation and an extreme pervasive mechanical motivation to acquire and consume, returning to an area is just as rewarding the second time you do it as the first. The monsters will generate anew, closer to your current level. The shelves will automatically restock, but you know where they are now. The chests will roll a new loot table. You might even find new scraps of actual story you may have missed. Fallout games have always used character and dialogue to shape the world and paint the player within it. That's still somewhat true here, but less than ever. It's stuff that shapes the world, stuff that binds the player to it, and stuff that ultimately self-justifies the game's design to the point where it can survive without the thematic literary elements I always thought were the heart of Fallout. As an isometric game in the late 90s, Fallout could not lean too heavily on visual storytelling. Fallout 1 and 2 are astonishing for how much they accomplish with comparatively little, visually speaking, but the hope was always that you would see vistas and details in your imagination more impressive than what your monitor could display. Even in combat, the percentages to hit and miss took second stage to the little green text box that would describe your hit, the sound of the impact, the expression of the attack, the violence of a targeted shot to the head, and the agony of a targeted shot to the groin. But let's look at one Fallout 1 city in particular, the Necropolis. It's huge, but narratively barren. Aside from the main quest and a few spare side quests, it's just tumble-down buildings, shuffling ghouls, and dark sewers. Exploring every corner of the Necropolis is pointless and a little boring. The narrative focuses the player's activity, and the lack of value in the old TV dinners and flip lighters that line the shelves of the ruined city makes scavenging feel, if not pointless, then at least largely optional. Once you get to the hidden vault at the center of the city, the plot really gets rolling. But little of the surface areas really mean much besides the impression of desolation they give. Much of it is functionally useless as a physical space in the game world. Fallout 76 may not have the story that led a player to the Necropolis back in Fallout 1, but neither does it have any physical space as underutilized as the Necropolis surface. Fallout 1 asked, how do you make a player see a world beyond what's on the screen? And its gears turn primarily on these longer-term arcs of character and narrative progression that paint these portraits in the imagination. Fallout 76 asks, how do you make a storage closet interesting every time? And pivots much more on the concerns of the extreme short-term, real-time combat and navigation that retain their excitement in the face of terminal repetition. In Fallout 1, a place that's narratively barren is mechanically barren as well. In Fallout 76, there is a larger effort to use every part of the animal as far as how the player engages on a minute-to-minute basis with the game world. Most of the commonplace items in Fallout 76, from Blamco mac and cheese to Buff-Out to Mr. Handy the Robot Butler, were creatively developed for Fallout 1. What was lost when Bethesda modernized the series with Fallout 3 was item descriptions, the short paragraphs that put this junk in context with your character's journey. For example, you could find old boxes of mac and cheese just like in Fallout 76 way back in Fallout 1, but instead of providing food value, or being monetarily valuable, it's just cheap detritus whose item description emphasizes how your character, having grown up in the vault, isn't quite sure what instant mac and cheese even means as a phrase. The thing is a valueless mystery of a gone-away world, so, having picked up one box of 80-year-old irradiated noodles and read the description, you're unlikely to do so again. It offers minor thematic value and then becomes a useless part of the game world, a prop. In Fallout 3 and forward, these food items can provide healing. You pick them up because they're now useful in a minor way. They now provide nutritional instead of thematic value. Fallout 76's low-key survival mechanics, insisting that your character eat and drink on a regular basis, further increases the desirability of these formerly decorative objects. But that's food. What about all the typewriters, all the screwdrivers, all the random junk that a Bethesda game still allows you to pick up? Fallout 3 gave you a gun that let you shoot junk as ammunition, and Fallout New Vegas made certain junk items meaningfully valuable as trade items, but it wasn't until Fallout 4 that Bethesda made all of this stuff purposeful. With that game, as with this one, every single object, no matter how inconsequential, has some kind of scrap component inside of it that can be broken down to use, and then these scrap components can be used to create, modify, and now to repair guns and armor as they degrade. Fallout 76 requires truly massive amounts of scrap in dozens of varieties to keep advancing your inventory in pace with your effective character level. They're parallel, symbiotic avenues of progression. You need stuff to kill creatures and finish quests. Killing creatures and finishing quests will lead you to stuff. If one of these systems of progression falls out of pace with the other, the difficulty feels awkward and the combat balance feels wrong. So, no matter how mundane a place, from a gas station to a shattered apartment building, even if it has no story value, each room in that building is a roll of the dice on something meaningfully valuable to the core experience of navigating the world of Fallout 76. Was it worth it to walk 3 minutes towards a map marker that's little more than a moldering farmstead? Absolutely. They had duct tape for adhesive and a wrench set you can melt for lead to make ammunition. They had 25-year-old Twinkies to eat and equally ancient cola to be used in making grenades. Little was learned, little of consequence happened. What enemies you killed and what things you took will return in time. And yet, in every corner of every room of every building on the property are little tiny hits of positive reinforcement that tell a player they found something useful and valuable and have done well in being so clever as to have found it at all. The flow of minor accomplishments is so fast and so wide that it's hard to notice sometimes the absence of the more esoteric, complicated things I'd thought that I would miss more. Instead, I float atop the superficiality of Fallout 76 in a little boat made of my own ego, casting out a fishing line that hooks treasure disguised as trash. No living NPCs mean that there are no real towns that don't functionally double as dungeon areas. There's no culture that isn't written down in journals or recorded on holotape still clutched by the withered fingers of the long dead. The 24 players spread across the map rarely create towns unless they already know each other in person or over voice chat. I can think of perhaps once that I ran across an actual building laid down by another player, and even then it was only a single structure. What this means to a player, though, is that like the scavenging loop or the experience loop, the explorative loop yields the same level of constant, undifferentiated positive feedback anywhere you choose to go. There's no hub of quest givers, no settlements to assist. Enemies and scrap have value, but enemies and scrap are everywhere. Occasionally, events and quests will supplement and enhance the value of the scrap or the number of the enemies. Yet, screws, adhesive, lead, ceramic, all the crafting materials are equally important at level 50 as they are at level 5. More so, really, since you need so much more of them to craft items rated at higher levels. And you need to break down dozens and dozens of the same weapon to unlock the more impressive modifications for it. A single weapon, from crafting to modification, can use something like 50 screws and 60 adhesive. Yet, these materials are only available in proportions that make sense. A house might have a toaster in the kitchen, a fan in the bedroom, and a typewriter on the desk, all with 1 or 2 springs and screws per item. Loot a newsroom, or the Capitol building, though, and there's typewriters galore. A barn might have a lot of metal and glue, a garage might have oil and circuitry. Towards the end of the main quest, you access a bunker with shelves and shelves full of useful things, but the most exciting, by far for me, was the 30 clipboards all on a shelf. 30 springs! What a haul! That's a dumb thing to get excited about, but I'm not even conveying how much of a thrill it was at the time. For Fallout 4, there were a ton of quests and a ton of NPCs, but it was rare for them to be memorable. It was rare for them to have names. Their blandness pulled focus from the free-form wandering that's been a critical part of the experience since Fallout 3. Fallout 76's quests are technically long, requiring multiple stops and pinballing a player to multiple corners of the map, but any individual part of the quest is quick, simple, and requires no choice or input besides obeying the map markers. Exploring the map and coming into contact with the unstructured parts of the game is something like half the focus of the structured, scripted content. Enemies will scale to a player's level, with some variation between regions, like the woodland around Vault 76 always being low level, and the cranberry bog being relentlessly high level. With every variety of building offering a sensibly scaled and rewarding variety of salvage, and every enemy type dropping a different sort of ammunition or animal scrap, it is impossible to go in a direction that isn't equally worthwhile and enriching. Since some of these elements are randomized and all of these elements regenerate, even repeating content you've seen before can yield new rewards. Fallout 76 has successfully crafted a moderately multiplayer game environment where 80% of the map remains useful and viable to a player through the very endgame, facilitating some significant freedom of choice when it comes to where you want to go and when. The best parts of Fallout 3 and 4 were the parts spent wandering, scavenging, piecing together the lost histories of the world's skeletons. Fallout 76 is only that part of the modern Fallout experience, with everything else surgically removed and strategically replaced. A big part of me is still very reluctant to simply accept that the dialogue-driven exposition that I loved in the old Interplay Fallouts in New Vegas just doesn't matter much to the Bethesda modern franchise. But it is self-defeating to ignore all the positives that this total reorientation towards the aspects of visual interactive world-building that Bethesda is known for being good at represents. Fallout 76 is not the game for those still mourning Van Buren or New Vegas. It'll piss you right off. But it is a significant, compelling evolution of the design values Bethesda has been playing around with and refining since Fallout 3. Think back on how Fallout 3 was covered by critics on release. It was a pretty universal comment that the best storytelling in the game was accomplished with skeletons and props. Remember the actual dialogue of the game? Have you seen my father, a middle-aged man? Fallout 76 honestly feels more closely tied to Fallout 3 than 4 sometimes, in how fully it pivots to that game's strengths and excises its weaknesses. Consider how Fallout 4's partial integration with the Fallout Shelter mobile game and its settlement mechanics meant that no settlement had a strong defined identity. It was instead left to the player to build those details from scratch themselves. They even let you build your own damn vault in the DLC. It was a lot. Too much to take charge of, while also following your curiosity across the landscape based on whim and quest marker, like you did in Fallout 3 in New Vegas. Fallout 4 was juggling a lot of sub-games at once. Parts of Fallout 3, parts of Fallout Shelter, a new crafting loop. The player's camp in Fallout 76 is a fun amount of customization that fits in more elegantly with the player's other concerns than settlements ever did, and the general rhythm of play is more consistent in Fallout 76 than it was in Fallout 4. The removal of dialogue is a bitter pill to swallow, sure, but it is a minor part of the overall Fallout 4 experience anyway, Far Harbor excluded. The dialogue wheel there generally only served to add some slight personalization to yes and no responses. And even in Fallout 3, the choices between good and evil were typically binary and often very silly, like deciding whether to fix or poison the water purifying system or whether or not you wanted to be a slaver. Fallout 76 has always-on microphone, or had until they decided to patch in a push-to-talk feature weeks after launch. Why have a dialogue tree, when the only people there are people who can already talk back, with their real mouth words? Multiplayer was, in this case, intended to functionally replace a scripted dialogue tree. A script is how you interact with a machine, and the intention was for the game to be, ideally, a more dynamic role-playing space than that, because you could speak as freely as you could at a tabletop. This aspect of the design, and I wonder to whose actual surprise this has been, turned out to be a complete dud. The kind of intentions they had for player behavior are obvious with the way factions are implemented in the game. Bethesda made a big deal about these factions before launch, which struck people as strange since there are no living NPCs. How are they supposed to work? Well, the main quests are designed as a tour of the map and a tour of the factions. First is their responders, wasteland good guys and good Samaritans, who function like the Minutemen. Only difference is, the Minutemen were focused on settlements, and the responders were focused on individuals in need to better fit with the removal of settlements and the primacy of emergent multiplayer play. If you're trying to be nice in the game, a helpful sort, doesn't that kind of make you a responder-ish? Then there's the Raiders, who it took me a while to realize don't actually exist in the game at all. Raider strongholds dot the mountains that divide the game's middle, filled with weapons and corpses. The first few times I went through, I saw the Raider corpses and thought another player had killed them. Then I realized how complete the removal of NPCs was. Raiders are replaced by the Scorched, which are like a new variety of feral ghoul with a central consciousness and who use weapons. Even the Raiders, cannon fodder since the very first game, are too sentient to coexist with 24 rambunctious players. Still, the Raiders have a robot with whom you spend a lot of time, and you get to know their values. Shootin', lootin'. Then the Brotherhood of Steel, technology hoarders that they are. And last, the Enclave, dangerous, manipulative. Even though the Enclave are traditional villains, all players must complete their quest line to complete what there is of a main plot and reach the endgame. The idea seems to be that these factions will represent the kinds of playstyles and self-directed goals and attitudes that a player might develop over the course of the game. A faction system that runs itself, right? Just add players. Unfortunately, the game world is so artificial and so thoroughly gamified that there's no pressure to actually role-play anything, little motivation to even speak to other players at all. Plus, an always-on microphone is intimate, in a way I don't think they planned on. Rather than encourage role-playing, it pulls the outside world into the game in immersion-damaging ways. You hear bong tokes, loud crunching and munching, screaming, cackling arguments between children, frustrated parents and spouses, demanding that players take a pause, and then those players testily explaining that they can't actually pause the game, and Jesus, would you hold on 2 seconds, please? It feels awkward to even contemplate doing an in-character out-loud roleplay when 9 times out of 10 the other person is just going to take a dab, belch, and loot the room while you prattle on. In creating an amusement park environment, they've created an amusement park mood. Just because you're in the same photo on the log ride doesn't make you brothers in arms. It's obvious to everyone involved that the stakes are low and the environment completely artificial. That shared understanding of a lack of meaning becomes a shared attitude, an attitude wildly intensified by unfiltered access to the living room soundscapes of total strain. Perhaps in later updates there'll be some mechanical system for faction allegiance, but at the moment they're just a naive hope that will never materialize without organizational guidance from the game systems themselves. The faction system that there is detrimental to the general storytelling as well, because those factions are so obviously centered around potential playstyles and player interests more than they are humanistic principles of values and vision. The responders are a reasonable idea, but that they should be a whole power block seems weird. Or the Free States, a collection of bunkers built by American secessionists. They've got one of the longest, farthest-reaching backstories in the game, with terminals and environmental clues painting a clearer and clearer picture of who they were and what they wanted. Essentially, they're a doomsday prepper movement given a kind of moral authority by the plot, extremely close to how Far Cry 5 articulated one group of preppers as being the good ones. In the world of Fallout, it makes more sense. The government actually is demonstrably lying to and experimenting on its citizens in gross and cruel ways. Not trusting Vault Tech is a great call. But there doesn't seem to be more than a dozen or so people in the Free States, with small families having their own shelters. Thematically, it's a working-class nuclear family rebuttal of Vault Tech's elitist social engineering and some of the game world's more cynical political commentary. Their presence in the script and the landscape is disproportionately large compared to their actual number and strength. Or the Brotherhood of Steel's presence in the game, which is a little absurd given the lore of the franchise. Consider the last major spin-off, Fallout Tactics. It needed the Brotherhood as a foundation to build a military squad combat game off, so it sent them on a Zeppelin-driven journey following the super mutants as they moved east following the climax of Fallout 1. It's canonically a little dubious, taking place in the Midwest and making it seem like that was the furthest east the Brotherhood had ever gotten. Fallout 3 takes place afterwards, deeper into that mutant migration. They pick up where Fallout Tactics left off. So those guys in Fallout 3 made sense, and then Fallout 4 was geographically right next door to Fallout 3 and chronologically afterwards, so that goes to follow as well. However, having both super mutants and the Brotherhood in Appalachia 25 years after the war only makes sense from a marketing perspective, not a lore-driven one. Bethesda released a very catty response to fan grousing by saying they won't be creatively beholden to the errata of 20-year-old games. But for me, the issue is that in choosing to recycle these elements, they're making a choice not to be creative within the new setting, relying instead on post hoc justifications to maximize brand recognition in trailers and advertising material. For example, even though the Scorched clearly began as a way to replace the Raider class of enemy, the main plot's steady unraveling of their origins is interesting, and finding their source is one of the game's few truly engaging mysteries. Nuking the fissure at the heart of their nest network releases the Scorch Beast Queen, boss of the whole game world, a raid creature intended to be defeated by 8 players or more. By contrast, the super mutants are there because there were vats of green goo just like the military base in Fallout 1, here too. Seeing the vats is fun, but it's hardly a mystery, just an entertaining callback that makes for an adequate explanation of their presence. The amount of effort put into making it seem reasonable for the Brotherhood of Steel to be operating in the region, though, is intense. There are holotapes that would be a lore junkie's dream in days past, like audio of the formation of the Brotherhood and the opinions of the men and women who forged its strange and insular culture. Would be, anyway, because the whole thing feels so desperate to explain the choice to include them at all that it makes the lore seem somehow dubious. It's Bethesda's world now. They make the creative calls. All of this is official stuff. But listening to this retrofit backstory now, addendums and modifications to the lore of the very first game, it makes me a little sad. Had they made something up entirely from scratch, I would have been more engaged by it. I would have respected it more. Fallout 76 is brash and bold in its rejection of elements of the old games it doesn't mechanically or thematically want, and I'm willing to meet it there, in those novel places that it is so damn insistent on taking me. But with the Brotherhood of Steel, this nostalgic self-cannibalism runs aggressively counter to that spirit of novelty, and emphasizes the differences between this game and the old ones in an unfavorable way. Setting up parallels between the old world-weary Maxon from Fallout 1 and the young, domineering presence on Fallout 76's holotapes only highlights how much more natural the old storytelling felt. If I'm willing to give up on what I wanted in favor of being open to the new thing that they've actually made, I really wish that they were bold enough to take off the training wheels and put as much confident novelty into the writing as they did into the structural design. I mean, there's so much of this game that makes it seem like they just didn't give a fuck. But it doesn't apply universally. The Enclave's role in the game as villain, merchant, and nuclear command center is even weirder. By making every player a member, the Enclave is utterly defanged of any thematic significance or weight. They're just another ride at the park. Good, evil, those are illustrations on the side of a soda cup, like the rebels and the Empire at Disneyland. You'd think, after everything you've seen, you wouldn't want to launch a nuclear bomb, or do the dirty work of the villain from both Fallouts 2 and 3, or that any kind of honest attempt to roleplay in the world would reckon with this as a dilemma. A dilemma, though, would mean that you wouldn't get to ride the biggest, most dangerous ride in the park. Fallout 76 doesn't want anything to stand in between you and the front of the line for the thermonuclear thrill coaster. The flip side of the plot's sometimes frustrating writing is that you encounter it sporadically and casually, so when something good does come up, you remember it more. Some of it can be extremely well written, like the Overseer's logs. Her character feels grounded and real in a way that the game rarely does, when rusty, dented nanny robots are sending you to look for children who went missing 2 decades in an apocalypse ago. And many individual journal entries are emotionally weighted, well written. It's the cumulative picture, though, its tonal inconsistency, and the obvious favor shown toward marketability over creativity in some key areas that eats away at the mosaic of believability that these fragments of creativity are trying to create. The whole no NPCs rule starts to feel very arbitrary by the end of the game, since robots fulfill NPC functions anyway by delivering dialogue, starting and ending quests, even providing occasional flavor dialogue, like two bots I came across in an endless loop of questions, or the Mr. Prize bot who whirs up out of the wilderness to give you exciting coupons and certificates for businesses that no longer exist. The biggest exception is a sly, rare one. There's a wandering super mutant named Graham who will sell you things. That's all. Just a merchant of an enemy type that already exists in the game. But this exception kind of breaks the rule, or at least renders it extremely suspect. I came across him twice in 116 hours of play. Graham may be insignificant, but if Graham, why not the world? I feel like I get the basic concept of what they did to make a space that players aren't capable of significantly disrupting. Even with the nuclear missiles, you aren't allowed to nuke the starting area, and it's an intentional function of the endgame. They've accounted for it. Think, though, on that scene from HBO's Westworld reboot, where a guy, a player, drunk at the card table, gets up and starts killing everyone around him, laughing at the sport of it. The park workers who come in to clean up after him and reset the saloon are incredibly irritated by his outburst. There's only so much time before other customers, other players, show up who will want bartenders to be alive to pour them drinks and saloon girls unblemished. Sowing deliberate chaos in a single-player game is controllable. You have only your own save file to break. Sowing trollish chaos in a connected multiplayer environment is a more difficult thing to manage by far. If they make a town with people and lives, what's to stop some number of those 24 players from just relentlessly fucking with them for no good reason until the game breaks? It makes quests easier to shatter. It makes everything more complicated. Still, other MMOs have been dealing with this for decades by simply making key NPCs immortal. If you've played World of Warcraft, you've certainly seen a town or two full of corpses with 3 quest givers still standing, incapable of perceiving that things aren't quite normal that day. This is awkward, but certainly no more awkward than the total removal of non-player humans. The Overseer is still alive during your journeys, after all. Her final holotape comments on players launching nuclear missiles. She's against it, for what it's worth. A moral plea that means very little against the endgame crafting loop that requires you to venture into these blast zones. All the other characters on the holotapes are dead. She's just absent. It's strange to be chastised by someone who's kind of theoretical as a character. Couple that with Graham, though. A living NPC functioning normally. If Fallout 76 isn't 100% committed to not having NPCs, why did they go 95% of the way in that direction? Of course, there's more to Fallout 76 than is available now. Every numbered vault in the game, which is all of them except Vault 76, Vault Tech Test Vault, and the White Springs Bunker, are sealed off and inaccessible. It turns out that Bethesda did say, pre-release, that this was how it was going to be, but I had missed that, and I was extremely frustrated by the vault's closures. Point is, though, that the vaults represent whole new areas, systems, and features that are, as of this writing, not yet implemented. Fallout 76 is part of the new era of games as service, and by withholding this content, they provide a reason to come back later. I think that's sketchy and frustrating, but like I've said, I'm not the one in charge of Fallout. Perhaps there will be NPCs there, finally. Maybe you'll meet the Overseer. Maybe there will be some kind of closure to the plot besides nuke the Scorch Beasts to make them larger. Who knows? But the whole no NPCs rule is a perplexing rule that they've already functionally broken many times over. Having everyone dead is intended to provoke a kind of pervasive melancholy, but the structural ramifications and the naked artificiality of the decision never let that melancholy come through very well for me. Like Fallout 3, I felt like the world I was in was rough, dangerous, but also irredeemably ridiculous and silly. Certain moments, certain vistas, can absolutely feel desolate and meaningfully bleak, but the moment is fragile and sure to pass. Weather effects are varied and impressive, from radiation storms a la Fallout 4 to more mellow instances of morning fog lit by brilliant sun or regular rain falling heavy through shadowed forest. Sometimes, though, the moments of beauty struggle to rise out of the technical problems that the game has. Certain regions, especially the Toxics Valley and the central north part of the map, seem washed out and muddied much of the time. Other areas, like the mire, are moody and beautiful on a consistent basis. The mire in particular leans heavily on the colored fog and god ray effects that the lighting system is particularly skilled at. The forests of the starting area can look incredible close-up and in the middle distance, but look underwhelming in the long view of the landscape, noticeably more artificial and bland than some of its contemporaries, like Far Cry 5, for instance. Then there's the ash heap to the southwest, the one truly apocalyptic part of the landscape. It does look incredible, and its danger scales well from levels 15 to 75. It's got deathclaws, ghouls, protest suppression robots, and these great stout fellas called mole miners who grunt and scream creepily through their old air filters. It feels the most traditionally Fallout out of any of the regions, and as such has some of the best vistas. Smoke-blackened skies, towns and roads torn apart by shifting ground, an intimidating and gorgeous excavator towering over everything. The final region of the game is the Cranberry Bog, a heavily mutated swamp. Its cranberry forests, towering otherworldly trees that puff out gorgeous clouds of colorful spores, are the most exotic thing in the game, although underutilized as yet in terms of plot and quests. The bog is interesting. It's got ruptures in the landscape, deep trenches hidden by foliage. On the one hand, these trenches are annoying as hell when trying to get from point A to point B, especially in power armor. On the other, the Cranberry Bog has the highest concentration on the map of Scorch Beasts, the totally not dragons of Fallout 76. These trenches give the player cover for moving around even when pursued by 2 or 3 of the Scorch Beasts, which is not an uncommon situation the closer you get to the southeastern corner of the map there. The thing about the map and these regions, though, is that they are absolutely enormous. The ash heap seems about the size of Far Harbor's map, for example, and it's one of the smaller regions of the world. The starting areas cover twice as much physical space as that, at least, a Smoky Mountain paradise of falling leaves and moldering farms that goes on for hours and hours. The tremendous scale of the physical space is the canvas on which the whole game is painted. The idea of co-op-driven repetition is palatable if there's so much to see that you rarely repeat the same things. The variation between the regions is appreciable, and each has its own beauty to it, from rugged industrial mountains to moody, sickly swamp to soft and mellow forests filled with golden light. Glitches get in the way. It's not always a gorgeous sight, but when it works, there's something to the look of the place that is unique. With a full wasteland, like New Vegas or Fallout 3, it's a lot of brown. Fallout 4 was much more deliberately colorful, but more in accents than primary hues. Fallout 76 goes full fantasy in its range of color, far beyond any previous Fallout title. It may not make total sense to have such a verdant world, but it's pleasing to the eye and resonant with the spirit, and that's all an imaginative landscape really requires when you get right down to it. Fallout 76's landscape actually does its best world-building once you've explored around thoroughly and gotten a solid sense of where things are and what they meant before the bombs fell. The greatest example is the monorail system. Despite its rural composition, Appalachia is home to a state-of-the-art, thoroughly atomic-era monorail system stretching across the entire southern reach of the map. Its transit takes it across some of the highest-level areas, through some rough and strange territory. The concrete support loops that the tracks run through, now shattered in many places, rise up and down the hills like a column of forlorn soldiers. When the monorail reaches a stop, like a scenic monument at the highest elevation in Appalachia or a park and ride at the automated city of Watauga, there's usually a monorail car stuck at the station filled with skeletons, suitcases, and precious, valuable miscellany. The game's most interesting and impressive piece of architecture is a key part of that monorail system, unconnected to any quests or events. It's an elevator for the monorails to get up a series of sheer cliffs, taking a train and rotating it thousands of feet in a go, with a massive kind of vertical centrifuge that, were it working, would swing the train up in a circle like a Ferris wheel car, moving from the bottom to the top where it switches off again and carries on. The view from the top of the elevator is the most scenic in the game, and you can even jump off it in power armor for a quick thrill. With scorch beasts in the distance, thick fog over what's left of Watauga, and the range of subtly changing light trickling in over the clouds, it is the place where the game kind of clicked for me all the way. Is it a little too close to Skyrim for comfort? Yeah, a bit. Is it frustrating in many ways? Sure. Yet, looking out over the top of the monorail elevator, the old Fallout feeling really does come through. A giant landscape, familiar in some ways but exotic in more, filled with possibility and lurking danger. The melancholy of a once great civilization toppled at its height by its own failings. The sense of both isolation and prowess that comes from surviving and persisting in a shattered world that's outgrown its human inhabitants. The monorail elevator doesn't have any lore or terminals associated with it that I could find, but its purpose and mechanism are clear just by looking at it, and the thing evokes perfectly the optimistic vision of power in the old world. If this existed today, it would be a world-famous engineering marvel, and yet, here it is in the West Virginia backwoods. Why? Well, the large-scale environmental storytelling answers that too, also mostly without journals or written lore. Consider the route and what's at either end of the monorail line. This is an expensive, excessive piece of equipment to put in. The monorail elevator is deliberately scenic, going up and over the tallest mountain when it would have been much cheaper to go around. Well, at one end, in the eastern part of the ash heap, are the retro-futuristic mansions of the two wealthiest families in Appalachia before the war. You can scavenge both mansions. They're amazing, some of the most stylish dungeoneering in Fallout 76. More to the point, though, is that these gigantic mansions are on stilts that quite literally have them looking down on the working men and women to the west. If you go west, you find the remnants of a massive labor protest against automation, skeletons still holding signs, with barriers laid across streets and pro-union slogans sprayed on the walls of the town's businesses. Above the skeletons, riot suppression robots still roam the neighborhood, still eager to kill after all these years. The monorail doesn't service any of the actual cities and towns of pre-war Appalachia, save one, Watauga, the center of all the automation that's being protested. At the far end of the monorail is the region's Robco corporate headquarters. Watauga is one of the most interesting areas of the game, and one of the last you'll visit. It's a pre-war automated bureaucracy that's still trying to function. It's got elevators that pop out wave after wave of robots, some dangerous, but most of them clerk bots with little suits and ties spray-painted on the chassis. If you can automate the miners, can't you automate the white-collar workers as well? The pre-war corporate vision for Appalachia was one where only one class of people remained employed. The executives. They would ride their silver monorail through the treetops and over the mountains from one office to another and then home again in time for a sumptuous, robot-prepared dinner. All of this safely to the south of the major population centers, whose jobs were drying up at a shockingly fast pace. This understanding of pre-war Appalachia doesn't come from any one thing. It's a dozen audio logs and journal entries, from skeletons and debris on the ground, from graffiti, from looking at the map and trying to think about why it is the way it is. Sometimes why it is the way it is silly, sometimes it's inexplicably frivolous in its world-building, but not all the time. In many ways, Fallout 76's world can be satisfyingly complete. The thing of it is that it takes miles and miles of exploring and hours upon hours invested in the game world before finding that clarity for it to become apparent. Part of the reason I kept playing, I think, is that despite the many frustrations, letdowns, and glitches, the more I played, the more complexity I did discover. I'm not saying Fallout 76 is a genius game after all, but I am saying that the first impression the game makes is only a sliver of what's there. It's not secretly deep. The game is what it is on the surface. But that surface stretches well over what horizon you can see from the hill you step out on when you leave the vault. It is a mightily inconsistent work, though. For each concrete, interesting piece of world building, there's a real eye-roller to go along with it. There's a questline in Fallout 76 that's a variant on Fallout 4's Silver Shadow questline, this time joining the Mistress of Mysteries and her crime-fighting crew. She was a comic book character and a radio serial star before the war, but after the war she decided to actually do it and built herself a super team and a super hideout. The only thing saving this from total cheese is how the quests are honestly more about character-driven family drama than comic book mayhem when you get into the holotapes. It sends you off to fight the Raiders, who are all dead, on behalf of the Order of Mysteries, whose corpses also all eventually make an appearance. The whole thing falls a little flat. Is it the writing? I'm not sure. The writing is above average for Bethesda, actually. More grounded in character than most of what they did with the Silver Shroud. It's more that performing present-tense activities for past-tense characters based on dramatic circumstances that resolved themselves something like a decade previous to your involvement is difficult to feel much urgency about. Of course, you'll be rewarded magically and automatically for completing the quests, and at the end of it you'll finish the story, but these are weak motivators. What really got to me, though, wasn't the structure, it was the reward. The Sword of Bastet. It's a great melee weapon. It's fast, with bonus armor penetration, good damage. You can upgrade it to a point to keep it current with your level. So, whenever I was low on ammunition, which happens a lot later on as enemies become real bullet sponges at higher levels, I had a magic sword to use. I found myself wandering through this autumnal forest fighting goddamn wolves and zombies with a magic sword, and man, it pissed me off, because even though I did enjoy Skyrim, I wanted more concrete creative separation between the two franchises than this. The weapons that legendary creatures drop work the same way, with bonus attributes that are often flat-out magic nonsense. It was the same way with Fallout 4, but here it feels especially frustrating when paired with all the other absurdist design choices. Take, for example, a vampiric power fist that transfers health on a successful hit. It's a common fantasy enchantment. How it got here, I don't know. Yet, I wouldn't have been able to solo the launch silo at the end of the main quest without it. I used over 900 rounds of ammunition in that dungeon and barely got over halfway through. I ran out of stim packs. All that was left was circle strafing and punching, and that turned out to be enough. I'm grateful for having had an enchanted gauntlet when I needed one, but I'm still irritated by how it further erodes the franchise's unique setting in pursuit of a kind of full-spectrum Bethesda game medley, borrowing freely from other games in the Bethesda back catalog. You'll find yourself looking for mines with the same icon they've used for mines since Oblivion, and then go delving in them for ore and coin of the realm. It's not like Fallout hasn't always drawn certain parallels between its setting and fantasy ones, especially with the Brotherhood of Steel and Power Armor, but usually referentially and never so experientially as this. The overall feel of Fallout 76 is still primarily Fallout, but some individual moments are infuriatingly ambiguous when it comes to being able to tell exactly which Bethesda game it is you're playing. It makes a huge difference that, whatever game it happens to feel like in a given moment, you can play this game with other people. I played the game about half solo and half with my friend Nate, and my time spent in co-op was the most fun by a good margin. When playing solo, I found myself going slower and being more thorough. I read a lot of journals, I picked a lot of locks. In co-op, though, there's an impetus to move a little faster than that. Player voice chat drowns out most radio messages and holotape stories, and two people grabbing items off the shelves and stuffing their pockets makes the whole process of scavenging and exploring a location go very quickly. Plus, co-op parties mitigate the difficulty of the game quite a bit, and the rhythm of combat feels most exciting and least grindy with about 2 to 3 people. More than that, and you're competing for kills and resources excessively. Remember, you can't loot enemies that you didn't damage while they were alive. In those small groups, though, the space feels casually social in the way that I can only imagine that Bethesda did intend it to. Before release, there was a live-action trailer for Fallout 76 featuring Hollywood youths in vault suits dancing to the Beach Boys while firing guns in slow motion. It was worryingly stupid. But I get it now. I do. The scale, the comfort of repetition, the games-as-service trickle of updates and new content, the quick and easy questing, so much of what makes Fallout 76 unusual or perhaps uneven in the rhythms of its single-player come together to make the co-op experience light, fast, and fun. Fallout 76's theme park atmosphere, coupled with group chat via the game client or over Discord, is relentlessly, effortlessly entertaining. It's a truly giant space in which to hang out and have fun. Nate and I live over 1,000 miles apart, but it felt like the same room when we were just hanging out and killing super mutants together, chatting about our days and our lives while the game went on almost like a secondary background activity. Fallout 76 was a platform for socialization, not the subject or the focus of that socialization. It was here, actually, that the legacy mechanics from Fallout 4 do cause some problems. First, carry weight seems to be overall reduced from earlier games, with each point of strength adding 5 points to your maximum carry weight instead of 10. So even with the many perk cards centered around weight reduction, you're usually only looking at 100 pounds or so of spare room to work with in your inventory. If you can find a workbench of some sort, you can break all those inventory items down into less weighty versions. Functionally, though, this translates into the equivalent of an inventory bladder that you have to drain every 10 minutes or lose your ability to run due to over-encumbrance. If you're over-encumbered and your party isn't, they'll leave you behind in a flash, unless they're just being polite that way. The game pivots entirely to acquiring, dismantling, and modifying loot and garbage in its game loops, and yet the game is very quick to punish a player for trying to take everything there is to take. Inventory management is the #1 mood and momentum killer in the game, though in single-player it's a little less urgent in how annoying it is. There, at least, the inconvenience is yours alone to bear. Here, Fast travel is also disabled not only for over-encumbrance, but also if you're dehydrated or starving. There were many, many times where I found myself separated from my party for over 10 minutes, waddling around, trying to find a workbench to reduce my inventory load, and find food to satiate the parasites coiled in my gut. Surely, at some point in the extensive playtesting, they must have realized that constant inventory micromanagement is a rhythmic choke point in the gameplay. Yet, there's no alternative that I can think of that wouldn't just cause more problems. Just think of the stash box drama. You can access your junk hoard from anywhere you find one of the stash boxes. That hoard maxed out at 400 pounds, though, which is functionally an inconveniently low number. It was the top requested change from the beta period to expand the stash limit. It took weeks to implement the change, though, because the 400-pound limit was arrived at not for player comfort, but because having the world track significantly more objects than 400 pounds worth caused massive stability problems for the game. The amount of variables being tracked across 24 players a server is just outrageous, and solutions that seem obvious, like, hey, just raise the stash limit, why don't you, are often bound up in mathematical complications imperceptible to the player. The scavenging loop works okay in co-op, but shaking it up not only would negatively affect the difficulty for a player to have significantly more carry weight, it would also be a major numerical burden for the game engine itself. It's kind of the thing about Fallout 76. There's a lot of stuff that seems ill-conceived and weird, but that stuff is baked into the game so deeply that it's hard to imagine a solution to these problems that isn't actually just a different game entirely. The best example of one of those unalterably strange game features is the climactic one. Launching a nuclear missile anywhere you please, save the Flatwoods area out of mandatory courtesy to low-level players. It's the end of the main quest chain. Every player who seeks to finish the story finishes it in a nuclear fireball. And let's get this out of the way. It's dope. It's wicked sick. It's like, kaboom, and I'm like, what? Whoa. And if you're expecting more out of it than that, well, buddy, I have some bad news for you. This is the only actual decision you get to make as a character in the plot, where you personally would like the extremely big boom to happen. The special effects for the nuclear explosion really are something impressive. You hear it whistling, you see the missile, disproportionately large but meant to be visible, and then this giant explosion, the shockwave, the mushroom cloud. It adds violent orange and red smoke and fire to a smaller area than you'd think around the blast, and then spawns new high-level enemies and resources in the nuclear haze. Myself, I chose to nuke Grafton. I didn't care much for the overly cheerful robot mayor there. But it's too much to ask the nuclear bomb to actually scar or deform the map. Instead, the nuclear blast is applied like a decal to the surface of the world. Grafton was completely intact after nuking it, and functioned normally for events and quests that were going on previous to my nuking it. The enemies were just a bit more numerous and difficult. For 4 hours, Grafton would carry these altered enemy spawns and loot tables. Then, it would return completely to normal. Again, this makes pragmatic sense for a 24-person multiplayer environment. It's also a bizarre betrayal of one of Fallout's most traditionally obvious opinions, which is that nuclear war is bad, actually. The Overseer's logs even reiterate this within the game world, but who's listening to her when it means not listening to the almighty quest compass? It's constructed as the climax in every way, from the structure of the main quest, to the progression of the player as an engine of destruction, to the inevitable terminal endpoint where a player has seen just about all the world has to offer, and what's left is to just poke it with a stick until they get bored. Fallout 4's Nuka World operated on the same principle as the very last piece of DLC for that game. Once you've finished that bonus map, you unlock a new feature to raid the settlements that you've built and once protected from that exact same sort of raid or assault. What changed? Not your relationship to the inhabitants. They were never more than Sims, a resource in the settlement minigame to be placated with crops, beds, and defenses. You'd have to believe in these people to be bothered by betraying them. It's your relationship to the game that changed instead. It's over, and you're twisting the rag for that last ounce of novelty. The worth of using nukes is weighed by many of the factions in the game with Fallout 76. Initially, the Overseer meant to use them against the Scorched. So did the Brotherhood of Steel, even though they never got that far. And the Enclave, well, they just enjoy blowing stuff up. It gives their computer's mustache a real nice twirl. It's only at the last minute that the Overseer had two big epiphanies. One is that the factions, in their self-interest, doomed themselves by not overcoming their differences and banding together against a greater threat. 2 is that launching the nukes is just the sort of careless destruction humanity will have to move past to win the battle. And isn't that true? The nukes just make the monsters much, much worse, which is fun, but bad, right? But also fun. Fallout 76's moral dilemma here is like a 10-year-old child's. Yeah, it's supposed to be bad to set off fireworks inside the house, but what if it's really cool and everything turns out fine? Maybe Mom and Dad are wildly exaggerating how bad the firework in the house situation will be. This is the 5-megaton explosion that breaks the camel's back when it comes to any kind of thematic depth or meaning. It all kind of falls away in the face of using the most dangerous and destructive device ever created recreationally. I desperately want to believe in Appalachia, because it can be quite beautiful, rugged and strange in the best of ways. But it's not a world in the end. It's a toy. It's an amusement. The early Fallouts in New Vegas painted pictures of a world that was strange, but consistent, believable. They made sense. You launched a nuke in New Vegas in a similarly climactic moment, and it was hard not to see it as a kind of crime. You could elect not to launch the missile at all if you didn't want to. If you decided to anyway, a new area would open up with either Caesar's Legion or the NCR, or both, turned into ghouls and horribly deformed. What you did made the world worse. It sunk it deeper into the radioactive pit that it was trying so hard to climb out of. Here, in Fallout 76, that nuke is a game mechanic meant to create savage playgrounds for players to come together and hunt in. It's an activity. You can repeat it 3 times a week, even. It's just about the most serious thing you can do in the Fallout universe, and ours for that matter, but here it's presented in a way that robs it of all dramatic weight in favor of pure, gleeful novelty. Fallout 3 did do the same thing with Megaton, but even there, you could only do it once in that very particular circumstance. By making nuking whatever you like a repeatable mechanic in Fallout 76, even the novelty sees diminishing returns. When a game revolving around nuclear apocalypse trivializes that apocalypse to the point where people are in danger of growing comfortable and bored with it, where do you even go as a franchise? I don't think Bethesda actually walked this idea all the way to the finish line. I think they got to Big Boom Looks V Cool, underlined it on the whiteboard, and here we are. It is maddening that an unmarked monorail system satisfactorily explains itself in a way that expands your understanding of the world, and the climactic act of the whole sprawling experience is comparatively shallow, absurd, and creatively counterproductive. How does a game get to that point? Well, here's where we come back around to Far Cry 5. Hope County and Appalachia are twin worlds. The new Far Cry is even going to literally split the little difference there is between the two games, with a verdant post-apocalypse set a couple decades after the nuclear hellfire at the end of Far Cry 5, for Far Cry New Dawn. Both Hope County and Appalachia portray an America of good, honest, rural people under siege from both nefarious conspiracy and a modern economy that's pulling away from them. Hope County was predicated on an economic recession, foreclosure crisis, the feeling that everything was falling apart. It led to a separatist movement of bunker dwellers, independent of the U.S. government, some good, some bad. Pre-war Appalachia was predicated on the popping of a consumerist bubble, the looming specter of automation and massive job loss, the feeling that everything was falling apart. It led to a separatist movement of bunker dwellers, independent of the U.S. government, some good, some bad. Can you articulate the difference between the Whitetail Militia in Far Cry 5 and the Free States of Fallout 76? Because I can't. More than the individual details, though, it's the attitude of both games and both game worlds. It's what the Overseer says. The peoples of Appalachia are all dead because they couldn't overcome their factionalism and unite for an optimistic future. She's a Vault-Tec employee all the way. She went to Vault-Tec University, trained all her life to lead Vault 76. It's only luck of the draw that the Overseer didn't wind up in charge of one of the crueler social experiments. Would she have simply gone along with it if she did wind up in charge of one of them? It's hard to say. She means well, despite being a figure of suspicious authority. Same with Far Cry 5. You were a sheriff, an outsider to the community, but a beacon of order and establishment nonetheless. Hope County and Appalachia take a simple but strong central stance on present-day actual America by choosing to focus on the essential goodness of rural communities. After the 2016 elections, there was a realization that these heartland areas were being left out of pop culture, and failure to engage with their stories was carrying a price in the cultural conversation at large. So Far Cry 5's Montana and Fallout 76's West Virginia conceptually come from what the developers want to say about those actual places first, before any fiction is applied. The way the locals in the landscape are portrayed is a reaffirmation of old stories and old sentiments, the idea that we're all Americans together when put under pressure, even if we fall apart in our moments of wealth and leisure. No doubt, many of the developers are of the age to remember that post-9/11 sentiment, the last moment of national unity that I can personally recall feeling tangible. And even that was a fragile, passing thing, just a couple weeks there. All those responder stories in Fallout 76, isn't that what it reminds you of a bit? You take an idealized version of these landscapes, golden rolling hills and deep forests dotted with red farmhouses and cozy towns where the gas station still has the old style of pumps and the diner is always packed. Then you add monsters and you add conflict, the fiction. You make the bad guys evil, just fundamentally bad, so you can have an antagonistic force that opposes the Norman Rockwell Brigade while never actually articulating a viewpoint that would have to stand in contrast to some American principle or belief. That way, what constitutes American principle and belief remains ambiguous. It redirects to the people, their bravery and compassion under extraordinary circumstances. Putting these perfect, beautiful places in danger and then letting the player tackle that danger puts the player in the position of actively reaffirming these mythological self-conceptions. The homesteading frame of Fallout 76 really gives it all away, with the whole 300 Years of America celebration being the very first thing you see when you step out of the vault. America broke. But it's okay. You can fix it. You can put it back how it was before, however you happen to personally conceive that before to be. This nostalgic centrism is causing some strange ripples in what games have been saying lately, or more often, not saying. There's real anxiety behind Fallout 76 and Far Cry 5, yet that anxiety never finds actual release in the game's fiction because of their deliberate lack of specificity and concreteness of perspective. The Overseer in Fallout 76 says that if we can't all ignore our ideology and come together, we're all gonna die. Trick of it is, ideologies are the cornerstone of so much sci-fi world building. You ask, what if? Why not? You use an imaginative tapestry to try to paint a world of ideas in conflict, and then you let those conflicts play out. Think of all the ideologies and factions in Fallout 1 and 2. Factional conflict is the whole structural foundation of Fallout New Vegas. Fallout 76 is anxious that division is tearing us apart, and that fear has left it utterly unequipped to tell a believable story about putting it all back together again. Differences are what make and drive a story. If you take away everything but what we can all agree on, what are we left with? We're left with that it's exciting to shoot monsters and take their things, that it's good to have fun with your friends, and that big explosions are very pretty. All those things are true, and they all do contribute towards making the game a genuinely enjoyable one to play. It's fun! It is fun. Fallout for me, though, has never been so much about fun as it is an escape into another world. The depth, specificity, and boldness of the storytelling always used to take me there, to that transcendent other place inside my imagination. As fun as Fallout 76 can be, it never transported me like that. Fallout 76 is shallow. Its world is absurd. Its world is broken. And furthermore, I'm surrounded by strangers who are all trying to burn the place down because it's entertaining and we're all pretty bored. That is too close to my own world for comfort. Thanks for watching. This video and all the videos that I do on this channel are crowdfunded by the website Patreon. I'd like to take a moment to thank by name some of the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to keep these videos going. People like Arturo Corvarubis, Peñagua, Dirk Warbrule, Robionder, Brandon Boat, Matthew Mason, Galak, Josh, Dewey, Brian Pluckelman, Chris Kaon, David Carlson, Sean, Jacob Siegelman, N.K. Jemison, Bobby Sims, Morton Scanning, David Betancourt, Josh Farkas, Ashley Rain, Nobody, Leo Neal, Chris Larkey, Tui Nguyen, Dylan Ball, Michael Coonan, Jeremy Sanders, C.E. Keane, Eric Jepson, Tyler Dowsey, Roman Alexev, Carl Gleason, Lassilus, Darian Desitel, Fergus Foley, Aurelian, Noah Kentrowitz, Tom Rowerdink, Your Local Moo, Tom Vickers, Danny Kilpatrick, Colin Gootee, Connor McLeod, Cybot D, Daniel Pining, Nate Williamson, Alexander Sundin, Ethan Cossett, Tim Marsh, Abdulrahman Alabsi, Radev Akoy, Andrew Tapp, Mark Phillips, Adrian Kamole, Skylar Vasily, Colby Howard, Nathan Jansen,
Argus Swift, Sorcerer Dave, Yazan Barghouti, Harry Eyeball, Free Morphine, Rich Stewart, David Orrin Christensen, Kazra Fadaussifard, Matthew Cassidy, David Harpstrite, I Cannot Fly, Sharif Kazemi, Wesley M., Greg Rucka, Matt Bargainquast, Q Ray X, Edward Small, Zach B., Erica Moonson, Colin Bassnett, Jordan Klein, Jesse Denton, Simon Nearfalk, Tyler Rush, Fakey McName, Scorpion Strike, Cassie, Jared Olszewski, Elweasel, Colin, Alex B., Piotr Kaspersik, Andrew Foltz, Byron Callan, Mikhail Aristov, Daniel Mower Myrie, Brad Smith, Micah Shalom Kesselman, Martin Lutz, Andy Mitchell, Eric Joyner, Ryan Van Dyke, The Soul James, Pascal Moret, Michael Atwell, Ian Boudreau, Nikolai, Lucas Barnard, Brennan Ritchie, Lupus Yonderboy, Alex Nikiforov, Cameron Booth, Gordon Graham, Stephen Hine, Max Pantoja, Sam Bellmeyer, Trivium Art History, Flebsy, Hans Kupier, Devin Fitzpatrick, Joaquin Coleman, Stephen Potyak, Andrew Boissonneau, Ivan Yanchev, Anxiety Cat, Clay Harrington, Philip Coffey, Eric Robinson, Kyle Zahner, Alex Zalato, Carl Clark, Stephen Garrett Day, Jean-Philippe Malouin, Will Edwards, Robert Glover, Jeanette N., Anthony Gallant, Maurice Descaro, The Noble Gamer, Nemo Vanderberg, Dice Prophet, Jack Harvey, Thomas Kistner, Andrew Opplinger, April Goloson, Will Wargrave, Noah, I know you're reading this out loud, Patrick McGanahan, Sebastian Pironi, Will Dobbins, Alexander Crons, Luke Murphy, Jean Hendrik Hansen, Tom Painter, Oscar Stangenberg, Edward Clayton Andrews, Tinfoil Pancakes, Samuel Procopio Xavier, Dominic Carlin, Kim Winson, Devin Vernon, Jacob McMillan, Tizar Vicarian, Medal of Connor, Jody Warren, Elijah Nelson, Robot Ghost, Greg Mirles, Aiden AK-47, Josh Graytack, Sean Weber, Andrew Bregager, Hercules Johnson, Will Hooten, Cy, Cole Allen, Alexander Romanov, Jesse Wilkinson, Alexander Ofudu, Lucas Marcondes Demora, Toadheart, Aaron Albach, Matthew Sutton, William Holmes, Manuel Weidman, Zach Korpstein, Ryan Snyder, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Dana Stubker, Ian Glascock, Jeremy McQuaid, Nicholas Ronga Jorgensen, Peter Flink, Tim Dodds, Jack 8A77AC8, Kevin Shaw, Anthony Bardill, Andrew Montevideo, Jared Meyer, Andreas Larson, Ryan Hill, Lars Braken, Igor Babiuk, Dan Thompson, Kumarin Vision, Alexander Leister, Morgan Mall, World War II Freak, Aaron Darwin, Eli Bergmass, Dennis Clark, Daniel Pennypacker, Corey Bofill, Jack Dawson, Nick Cole Hamilton, Carol Henderson, Reference Error, Milky Way Resident, Vance Jordan Falls, Soeb Sheik, Comfy Hat, Eddie Burton, Gabriel Nichols, Ron Gervais, Jeffrey McIntyre, Senball, Victor Felta, Edward Clayton Andrews, Simon Anderson, Jonathan C. Mitchell, James Mosca, Tyler Rush, Adam Buchem-Weiber, Lawrence Hurley, Transient Tiefling, Jordan Falls, Brent Cosman, Tom Vickers, Conceited Axis, Ludo Criticism, Kyle Kindred, Pipe Man, Homo Vulgaris, Adi Hegde, Tyler F., Markaleth, Mike Windsor, Cyril Lame, Agandine, Leo Peril, Oliver Ashton, Daniel Grinfort, Maxime Carignan Chagnon, Skeptical Frog, Max Cohen, Psychedelicat, Gorilka, Jackie Noir, Garrett Johnson, Toadheart, Valerian, Daniel Floyd, Vance Jordan Falls, Derek, Melquire, Gerard R. Hish, Lucas Kilogowski, and Tayson Turner, and the many more who are donating a smaller amount to help out with the channel. Every little bit helps these videos coming, and I'm deeply appreciative of all of it. Thank you, and I hope you all have had a good year.